It's an exciting story. You know, some people say, oh, you know, the Bible is just sort of old and mumbo jumbo. I can't understand what's being said in it. There's an exciting story, right? You know, Paul and Silas in prison. And the theme, I think, if I'm thinking of a theme out of what we heard today, is the word freedom. Now, we hear a lot about the word freedom. We will hear about that on Memorial Day in our town parks. Every year I go to the Memorial Day parade in Clinton, and every year there's a speaker. Every year the speaker says, you know, freedom isn't free. Every year I hear that. And we hear about freedom, and everyone shakes their head and nods their head and talks about freedom. But a lot of times, we don't really understand what it truly means to be free, right? We hear about freedom, we wave the flag, we hear politicians say that they're for freedom. That's generally a good thing to be for, right? If you hear a politician saying that they're against freedom, it probably is not a good thing. But everybody's for freedom, yet we don't really appreciate it. We don't understand what it means. We don't get it. If you want to understand what it feels to be free, think about those 3 women in Cleveland, right? 3 women trapped in that house with that monster for 10 years. And all of a sudden they break out. Can you imagine how they felt? Walking through that door, or crawling through the door, whatever they had to do to get out. It's freedom. Outside, breathing the air, seeing the sun, talking to who you want to talk to. Freedom. Freedom's a wonderful feeling. But a lot of times, we think we're free. We think we're free. We're saying we're not locked up in any prison cell. I'm not doing time. I live in the United States of America. I'm free. And yet Jesus says, at one point to the Pharisees, that they're slaves. They say, what? We're not slaves. We're all free. What are you talking about? We don't realize or recognize the walls which we build, the bars which we are behind, of our own making, often, which keep us in bondage to the things of this world, that keep us in bondage to sin, which keep us in bondage to society. And while we think we're free, while we think we're making all these decisions on our own, oftentimes we are held captive. We are held captive. And the good news is that Christ says that I have come to set the captives free. I have come to free you from bondage. I've come to proclaim the year of release. I'm throwing wide open the doors. I'm letting you out. I've paid the price. You are free, and yet so often we do not recognize that. Our story from the book of Acts has 2 different scenarios, 2 different little stories. And each of those stories tells us about freedom. And it tells how some people get it wrong and how some people get it right. The first story is about a slave girl and her masters. And you think, well, the slave girl is in bondage and the masters are free, but it turns out that they're all in bondage at the beginning of the story, and that's sort of where they are at the end of the story. See, this girl has the power of fortune telling. She can tell who people are. And she's walking behind Paul and Silas and the disciples that are with Paul and Silas, saying, these men are servants of the Most High God. They have the way of salvation, and they can free you. The problem is that while she is saying that, proclaiming that, she doesn't really understand or experience it. There are a lot of people who will tell you who Jesus is, and they'll say, you know, you gotta go to church to be saved. You gotta do this. You gotta do that. They'll proclaim Jesus as Lord, and yet they will not experience the freedom which He wants. Jesus says, people will say, Lord, Lord. Not everyone who says, Lord, Lord, will enter the kingdom of heaven, but only he who does the will of my Father who is in heaven. And there she is. She is proclaiming them to be servants of God, and yet she doesn't really recognize what's going on. And Paul is so furious about this lady following her around. It was probably nice the first time, right? Oh, you're the servants of the Most High God. That's great. But she just, imagine someone following you around the city, just saying that all the time. He finally turns around to her and says to the Spirit, come out of her in the name of Jesus. And the Spirit leaves her. And at that time, we understand who really is in slavery. The masters are actually enslaved because the only way they are making money is off this girl and, you know, the power to fortune tell. And once that power to fortune tell is gone, they can't make any money. They've been dependent upon that slave girl. A lot of times we get dependent upon things which are wrong. We become dependent on things which are not proper. And we make our living off them. We do all sorts of things because of that. And when they're gone, what do? What do? We somehow have become our prisoners to evil spirits. The second half of the story shows how things are supposed to work. Now, Paul and Silas have been thrown into prison. And when they're thrown into prison, they're not just thrown into prison. They're taken into the jail, and they're taken and put in the innermost part of the jail. They are put into, the solitary confinement, the biggest, double maximum security type of part of the jail. And when they put them in the most maximum security part of the jail, they take them and they put their hands and feet in chains, and they shackle them to the wall. Can you think of anything more to hold someone in prison? If you want to deprive someone of their freedom, they've done it, right? Chained up, middle of the jail, with another jail outside, with a jailer outside back at the cage. You'd think that they had no freedom whatsoever, and yet they have complete freedom. What do Paul and Silas do while they're chained up? They're singing hymns. They're praising God. They're witnessing to other prisoners. They're letting other people know about Jesus. Despite the fact that they look to be enslaved, they are nothing but free. They have the freedom of Christ inside of them. Something which cannot be taken away from them. It cannot be taken away from them. No matter what is enslaving them, they are free. And that night an earthquake comes and breaks the chains, breaks down the walls, and you'd think, what's the first thing you do if you're a prisoner in jail? You'd be hightailing it out, right? Why are Paul and Silas hightailing it out? Because they were free to begin with. They were free to begin with. And so when the jailer wakes up and about to kill himself because all of his people have left, Paul says, don't worry, we're here. We didn't go anywhere. Now you would have thought the jailer was the one in total control. But what's the jailer? The jailer's about ready to kill himself because he's lost his prisoners. He was in effect a slave of his masters to keep them there. Paul and Silas are there saying, we haven't gone anywhere, and the jailer gets down on his knees and says, what must I do to be saved? And that, my friends, is the point of the entire story. What must I do to be saved? How can I have the freedom which you have? How can I feel that? Well, what Paul and Silas say is that you have to confess Jesus as Lord. That He's the Lord of your life. And when you do that, you will be free. You and your household. You got to repent, and you'll be free. A beautiful, beautiful image of the jailer and his family all going and becoming baptized and becoming Christians right then and there. The next day, the authorities say, well, you're free to leave. Paul says, he was free to leave to begin with. But I ain't going anywhere. I want an apology. Right? There's chutzpah, right? You know? It's not just, I'm free. I was always free. Now I want an apology, which he gets. Now, how is it that we are in a prison? How is it that we are slaves? How is it that we are in bondage? So quickly we fall into the bondage to sin. How quickly we fall into the bondage of our society. And we think that we are free, and yet we always feel those obligations to participate in things which are not appropriate or not right. A couple years ago, I didn't know about anybody having Sweet 16 parties in Clinton. No one had Sweet 16 parties. The only Sweet 16 party Liz went to was to a friend down in Long Island, which I got hoodwinked into driving her to. But now one kid has a Sweet 16 party, and then another girl has a Sweet 16 party, and all of a sudden everyone has to have these Sweet 16 parties. Not just, your little, having 5 friends over for cake and ice cream. It's, let's rent out the Aquavina restaurant, or let's rent out, someplace in Washington Mills, and, where did this come from? Everyone all of a sudden feels like they got to do something. Well, Mary had a big party, so Sue's got to have a big party, so Jane's got to have a. We get roped in. We think we're free to make these decisions, but sometimes we feel we can't be free to say no. We're not going to do that, right? Or we get tied in with our jobs, where they ask us to do things, and you say, well, that's not right. Well, if you don't want to do that, go find a job someplace else. We're tied in. We're slaves sometimes. We're not free. We get tied in with family obligations. We can't do that because, that might offend Aunt so-and-so, and we have to do this and that and the other thing. Right? Anybody ever felt enslaved by family obligations? Probably not in this church. Right? We become slave to those things. And most of all, we become slave to sin, to desire, to our wants, to wanting to have things which we don't need, to be wanting to be better than other people. We don't need to do that. When we